8 years ago, we embarked on what should have been the trip of a lifetime. The drive to Portugal was long but familiar. We'd done road trips together before, so we had our rhythm down, our stops mapped out. My van, my old beast of a home on wheels, roared down the roads with the spirit of something wild, something unstoppable. Every inch of that van had my personal touch: extra hooks to hang wetsuits, custom storage bins I'd spent entire weekends building, even a makeshift sleeping area with an old mattress cut to fit just right. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours, our sanctuary for this journey. In the van with me were the people who felt like family. Miguel was the loudest of us, with his booming laugh and never-ending stash of terrible road trip snacks. The man had a taste for the worst kinds of junk food, like those suspiciously neon orange cheese puffs that left your fingers stained for days. Every time we hit a stop, he'd dart off to find more, coming back with bags rustling, grinning like he'd found treasure. Robbie, on the other hand, was the chill one, always calm, always scanning the horizon with that distant look. He'd sit up front with me most of the time, his feet propped up on the dashboard, silently taking in the landscapes, occasionally giving a nod or a hum, as if he were cataloging each view, each moment. And then there was Jake. Jake was a different breed, charismatic, confident, a bit reckless in the way that made you want to keep up with him just to see if you could handle what he threw at you. He was the guy who would convince us to take detours to random cliffs, promising that it'd be worth the extra adventure. Half the time, he was right, but there was always this undertone with Jake, this competitive streak that would surface when we least expected it. He had a knack for pushing everyone just a little past their comfort zones, urging us to try that bigger wave, that steeper cliff, that longer paddle out into open water. Then there was my wife. She'd become part of this group naturally, slipping into our dynamics like she'd always been there. I'd felt a deep sense of pride seeing her laugh with these guys, knowing she was at ease, that she got along with my oldest friends. We'd always been good together, or so I thought. She'd helped plan every detail of this trip, listing out the essentials, reminding me of little things I'd forget in my excitement, like charging the solar lights for the campsite or packing enough water filters. I liked that about her, the way she grounded me, how she'd balance my impulsive nature with her careful attention to detail. When we finally reached Portugal, it was evening. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden glow over everything, and for a moment it felt like we'd driven straight into a postcard. The air was thick with salt, each breath tasting like the ocean, grounding me in the reality that we'd finally arrived. The campsite was secluded, a grove of twisted pine trees and rugged dunes shielding us from the rest of the world. I parked the van in a small clearing, the soft crunch of sand under the wheels giving way to a deep silence, broken only by the distant crash of waves. Setting up camp was quick work with everyone pitching in. Miguel was already setting up his hammock between two trees, muttering to himself about getting the perfect angle for watching the stars. Robbie started gathering firewood, and Jake hung around with his usual swagger, eyeing the beach with that look in his eye, like he was already sizing up the waves he'd tackle the next morning. My wife and I put together the essentials: our portable stove, the collapsible chairs we'd brought along, and the cozy little setup we'd planned for the nights we'd spend under the open sky. That night, as the fire crackled and the stars appeared one by one, I took a moment to appreciate it all. My friends, my wife, the beach that stretched endlessly before us. It was everything I'd hoped it would be. We laughed, swapping stories, ribbing each other over old memories, sharing beers and toasting to the trip we'd finally made happen after years of talking about it. I felt a sense of contentment I rarely experienced, like I was right where I was supposed to be, with the people who mattered most. I remember glancing over at my wife as she laughed at one of Miguel's jokes, her eyes shining in the firelight, and feeling a surge of affection for her. She'd been so excited for this trip, so dedicated to making it special. I didn't know then, of course, that beneath her laughter, beneath her smiles, something darker had already started to take root, a secret that would unravel everything I held dear. But that night, I was blissfully unaware, caught up in the moment, trusting in the people around me. The next morning, we set out to surf, the early light casting a warm glow over the waves. The beach was quiet, empty save for the occasional seagull squawking in the distance. The air was cool, crisp, with just a hint of salt, lingering as we trudged through the sand, boards tucked under our arms. This was it, the culmination of years of dreaming, planning, waiting. The water looked perfect, the waves rolling and gentle but strong, and I felt that familiar pull, that eagerness that never faded no matter how many times I'd surfed. As we suited up, something caught my eye. Jake was limping, his face twisted in frustration. He'd taken a fall the day before, while we were exploring some rocky cliffs, a stupid little misstep that had turned serious when he twisted his ankle. He was trying to play it cool, brushing off our concerns, but I could tell he was seething. Jake wasn't used to sitting out, wasn't used to watching from the sidelines. He was the kind of guy who hated missing out, who wanted to be in the thick of it, who'd push through pain just to avoid the thought of being left behind. Before we hit the water, I went over to check on him, to see if he was really all right. "You sure you're good, man?" I asked, watching him shift uncomfortably, his mouth set in a hard line. "I'll be fine," he muttered, his tone sharp. "Just go catch some waves. I'll be here when you get back." I didn't think much of it at the time. I patted him on the shoulder, gave him a nod, and jogged back to join the others, figuring he'd be sulking, but all right. I had no idea that his frustration was more than just an annoyance, that it was the spark that would ignite something far worse, something that would burn through every bit of trust I'd placed in him, in all of them. When we paddled out, I finally got to see my board in action. The LED lights lit up the water around me, casting this incredible glow that danced and shimmered with every movement. It felt surreal, like I was part of something larger, something magical. Each wave I caught felt like a revelation, like I'd tapped into some hidden energy, riding the very force of the ocean itself. My friends cheered, and for a few hours, nothing else mattered. We were just a group of guys chasing waves, laughing, living in a perfect moment. Hours passed, and when we finally dragged ourselves back to the shore, I was exhilarated, exhausted, my body aching in that satisfying way that comes after a day of hard, honest work. But as we approached the van, something felt off. My wife was already inside, tucked away in the back, seemingly asleep. She'd left early, I assumed because she'd gotten tired of watching us. At the time, I thought it was strange, but dismissed it as exhaustion. The next few days passed in a similar haze of surfing, camping, and camaraderie, but there was an odd tension I couldn't quite place. My wife seemed distant, quiet, and Jake, despite his injury, was always hovering around, trying to keep up, his frustration palpable. I chalked it up to his injured pride, to the fact that he was missing out, but that undercurrent of unease kept nagging at me, like a whisper I couldn't quite make out. Looking back, it was all so clear, the sideways glances, the hushed tones, the way Jake avoided my gaze whenever my wife was nearby. I'd been so wrapped up in the trip, in the dream of Portugal and the perfect waves, that I missed what was happening right under my nose. The days in Portugal passed in a blur, each one blending into the next as we settled into a routine. Mornings were all about the waves, the thrill of paddling out as the sun rose, the smell of salt in the air, and the taste of freedom. Evenings were for unwinding back at the campsite, sitting around the fire with our boards propped up against the van and cold beers in our hands. It was the sort of trip that felt timeless, like we'd somehow found a pocket of life that would last forever. I thought it was perfect, the culmination of years of dreaming and planning. But something was off. It started with small things, moments I brushed aside, convincing myself they didn't mean anything. My wife was quieter than usual, more reserved, like she was miles away even when she was sitting right beside me. There were times I'd catch her staring at the fire or out at the ocean, her face blank, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. I'd ask her if she was all right, if she was enjoying the trip, and she'd always smile, nod, and say yes. But it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that seemed to float on the surface, hiding something beneath. Jake was another story. The guy was like a live wire, agitated and restless. Every time he looked at me, I felt like there was something he wasn't saying, something he was holding back. He was still limping from his fall, hobbling around with a barely concealed frustration that seemed to seep out of him like poison. He'd hang back when we surfed, sitting on the shore with his foot propped up, watching us with a strange intensity. I chalked it up to jealousy or bitterness, figuring he was just pissed about missing out. Jake hated being sidelined. He wasn't used to being the guy who had to sit out and watch, while the rest of us did what he loved most. But there were these moments, fleeting yet sharp, that gave me pause. Like one evening, I came back from a solo surf session a little earlier than usual. The beach was quiet, and I took my time, soaking in the scenery, feeling that sense of awe and freedom that only the ocean could give. As I approached the campsite, I heard voices, soft, urgent whispers, coming from behind the van. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, tense, and hurried. When I rounded the corner, I found Jake and my wife standing close, too close, both of them going silent the moment they saw me. I felt a pang of discomfort, a knot tightening in my stomach, but I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking. Jake immediately started talking, launching into some joke, trying too hard to act casual. My wife, on the other hand, wouldn't meet my eyes, her gaze fixed on the ground. I tried to laugh it off, to join in, but that nagging feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. They were acting strangely, but I didn't want to believe there was anything to it. We were friends after all. Family. I trusted them both. Why wouldn't I? The tipping point came one night, a few days later. We'd all had a bit to drink, the fire crackling between us as we swapped stories and joked around. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, mingling with the faint scent of salt from the ocean nearby. I was leaning back, staring up at the stars, lost in a hazy, contented state. Jake had been quieter than usual that night, more subdued, his usual cocky edge softened by the alcohol and, I assumed, by the frustration of watching us surf while he was stuck on the shore. Then, without warning, he started talking about loyalty. It was strange, the way he brought it up out of nowhere, his voice thick with something I couldn't quite place. He looked around the circle, his gaze lingering on each of us in turn. But when he looked at me, there was something different in his eyes, something almost accusatory. He started going on about how loyalty was everything to him, how betrayal was the worst thing a person could do. His words were slurred, a little scattered, but there was an intensity in his tone that sent a chill down my spine. I felt my pulse quicken, my mind racing to keep up with what he was saying. There was a moment, a split second, where he looked at my wife, his gaze flickering with something I couldn't quite decipher. She was staring into the fire, her face tense, her jaw clenched. I glanced between them, trying to make sense of what was happening, of the strange energy pulsing between them. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the alcohol talking, that there was no reason to feel the way I did, but that night, as I lay in the van beside her, my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept replaying the look in Jake's eyes, the way my wife had looked away, the tension that had crackled between them like a live wire. I tried to shake it off, to push the thoughts aside, but they lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. I wanted to trust her, to believe that I was just overthinking, that the alcohol had made me see things that weren't there. The final blow came the next morning, in the harsh light of day. I woke up early, unable to shake the restlessness that had gripped me all night. I slipped out of the van quietly, not wanting to wake anyone, and made my way down to the beach. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the first rays of dawn casting a soft, pale glow over the water. I felt a strange sense of clarity in that moment, a calm that I hadn't felt in days. But as I turned back toward the campsite, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. The morning sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the beach as I trudged back toward the campsite. My mind was a storm, thoughts colliding, churning, caught between rage and disbelief. Each step felt like it took more effort than the last, my feet sinking into the sand, almost as if the earth itself was trying to hold me back, urging me to think this through before I confronted them. But I couldn't wait any longer. Every lie, every shared look, every whispered conversation they'd had behind my back, it all built up inside me, pressing against my chest, hot and suffocating. When I reached the campsite, I saw them both. Jake was leaning against the van, his injured leg propped up, arms crossed, watching me approach. He looked calm, almost smug, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. My wife was standing nearby, her face pale, eyes wide, her mouth set in a thin, anxious line. She wasn't looking at me, but staring down at the sand, avoiding my gaze as though I was some stranger walking toward her instead of the man she'd shared her life with. The silence between us was thick, charged with an intensity that made the air feel electric, prickling against my skin. I took a breath, trying to steady myself, to keep my voice calm, but the words came out harsher than I intended. "So," I said, my voice low, steady. "Anything you want to tell me, Jake?" He shifted, his jaw clenching, his eyes flickering with that same intensity I'd noticed in him the night before. For a moment, he held my gaze, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as though he was daring me to take this further, to make this confrontation real. "What's there to say?" he replied, his tone casual, dismissive. "I think you already know, don't you?" My fists clenched, the urge to hit him surging through me like fire. I'd trusted this man, let him into my life, my home. He was supposed to be my friend, my brother. And here he was, standing there, looking at me with a mix of pity and arrogance, like he'd gotten away with something and didn't regret it for a second. "You were my friend, Jake," I said, barely able to keep my voice from shaking. "How could you do this? I trusted you. We've been through hell together, and this is how you repay me?" Jake shrugged, crossing his arms over his chest, his gaze unwavering. "Things happen, man," he said, his voice cold, unfeeling. "Sometimes people change. Maybe you didn't notice, but she wasn't exactly happy. Guess I just filled a void." Hearing him speak so casually about her, about us, only fueled my anger. I looked at my wife, hoping for some sign of regret, of guilt, anything that would make this hurt less. But she was silent, still staring down at the sand, her arms wrapped around herself as if she could shield herself from the impact of my words. "And you," I said, turning to her, the bitterness seeping into my voice. "Was it worth it? Was he worth it? Or did you just need a thrill, something to break the monotony?" She flinched, her face paling even further, but she didn't respond. Her silence felt like a slap, as if my words didn't matter, as if the betrayal didn't matter. She finally looked up, her eyes meeting mine, but instead of guilt, I saw defensiveness, a cold determination that I'd never seen in her before. "I'm not going to apologize," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "We've been drifting apart for years. Maybe you just didn't notice, but I did. Jake, he made me feel something I haven't felt in a long time." The words hit me harder than any punch ever could. The reality of it sank in slowly, painfully, each word cutting deeper. All those years together, the laughter, the dreams we'd shared, they felt like lies now, memories twisted and tainted by what she'd done. I wanted to shout, to rage, to make them feel the hurt that was tearing through me, but instead, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a numbness that dulled the edges of my pain. "So that's it then?" I said, my voice hollow. You throw away everything we built for a fling? For a moment of feeling something? Jake shifted, looking down for the first time, perhaps realizing the weight of what he'd done, or maybe just regretting getting caught. My wife's face softened, and for a moment I thought I saw something resembling regret, but it was fleeting, like a shadow passing over her features. "I never wanted you to find out like this," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. "I wanted to talk, to tell you how I felt, but things just happened. The excuses, the rationalizations, they felt like knives twisting in wounds that were already raw." I clenched my jaw, feeling the anger boil over once more, fighting the urge to lash out, but I couldn't keep it in anymore. I took a step closer to Jake, my fists clenched, my body tense. "You think you're a hero, don't you, swooping in to rescue her from me?" I spat, my voice filled with venom. "You're nothing but a coward, taking what isn't yours, sneaking around behind my back." He looked up, meeting my gaze, his expression hardening. "Maybe I am," he said, his voice low, unyielding. "But maybe you didn't see what was right in front of you. She deserved better." The finality of his words struck me like a blow. I could feel the rage building up, white hot, filling every part of me, but I knew that if I let it loose, there'd be no coming back. So I took a step back, breathing deeply, letting the silence stretch between us. I turned to her one last time, hoping, somehow, that she'd say something, that she'd show some sign that this meant something, that it hadn't all been a lie. But she just stood there, her face expressionless, as if she was already miles away, already out of my life. "Then you both deserve each other," I said, the words feeling hollow, empty. "I hope you're happy, I really do, but don't ever come near me again." With that, I turned and walked away, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on me, each step pulling me deeper into the reality of what had happened. The sand felt cold beneath my feet, the salty air sharp and biting. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The life I'd known, the people I'd trusted, it was all gone, washed away like footprints on the shore. And as I walked away, the roar of the waves was the only sound that filled the empty silence.